Our last session is using the bowl and the towel. You might have noticed we haven't done the bowl and the towel yet. We're looking at living it out.
So we're hoping that this evening is going to have a little bit of a different slant,
a bit more
to
positive.
some of the others. So it's probably been quite a challenging and quite a difficult
Let's
course.
be honest, it was depressing last week, and that's okay. We can say it together. This is a safe space.
Hopefully not completely depressing. Hopefully you all got something from it. I mean, 16 of you have come back, so...
Thanks for coming back.
We can hope that at least 16 people found it a positive experience.
So, come on.
Tonight we're hoping that we're going to be thinking about living it out
Yeah.
and hope and serving and making things a bit more practical and hopefully a little bit more good newsy as we go through.
So our first question, quite simply, what does hope look like to you? And do not say, Nat managing a 20-second plank. Although, that would look like hope to me tonight. Honestly, my abs are really sore just from that 8 seconds.
Goodness me.
So what does hope look like to you in your life, in your community, and in your church?
So does hope look the same in all of these three things? Does it look different? Be as general or as specific as you want, really, I think. So what does hope look like to you?
Good evening, Alan.
Welcome,
You're just in time. What does hope look like to you? Just a reminder, we need you all to talk lots in the comments during these sessions. Otherwise, we babble even more. And that's not healthy for anybody. And it's our last session, so we should go out with a bang.
Definitely. I've noticed a few names that haven't popped up yet. That
I'm
are normally
concerned
some
Rachel
of our,
isn't here yet.
Normally some of our big contributors.
Yeah.
So tonight could be an interesting
Text
one.
Rachel, where are you, please?
And Moira.
Yeah, true, yeah. So, what does hope look like to you, Jess Hackett?
I don't want to say because I don't want to give people any answers.
Okay, then.
But I will if you really want me to.
Yeah, go on.
Answered a good one there.
Oh, yeah. That was going to be my go-to.
Hope looks like the vaccine sorting out this awful virus worldwide. I think hope to me, in some ways, doesn't just look like something different coming. So like going back to what we consider normal. But also I think hope can look like being at peace with the situation you find yourself in. I think there are some things that you shouldn't be at peace with, some things that you, as we've talked about over the last few sessions, that absolutely we're called to challenge and to change. But sometimes I think it can be about finding peace in a situation. So recognising that even after the vaccine is rolled out, there's still going to be all kinds of challenges related to COVID. It's not just something going to disappear. And so actually hope for me looks as much like being at peace with a world that is going to continue to be different, rather than hope is going to be everything changed. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, I think I do.
Good.
So Lyndon says hope is the opposite of despair. Yeah,
Excellent.
I like that. I also think of it as a kind of empty full thing. I don't know. There's that whole half glass, the glass half empty or glass half full.
An optimist says the glass is
Yeah.
half full, a pessimist says the glass is half empty, and an engineer says the glass is twice as big as it needs to be.
Here we go. Right, so Susan says, again, in the community, all the volunteers and the vaccine, definitely.
Tony says that it looks like grandchildren, people caring for one another and young people believing. Brilliant.
Great. That's definitely hope for the church, isn't it? The young people believing.
Bruce talking about hope being for the future and talking about mission and outreach team for his church. Brilliant. And Susan saying that hope is that things settle and she can cope better. Brilliant. I think often hope can be a really personal thing.
Yeah,
can't it?
definitely.
And that, as with other things, hope will look very different for each one of us depending on what it is that we're facing. I wonder whether there's a difference maybe between hope and optimism.
Maybe.
What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know if hope is kind of grounded in some sense of faith, really, if that makes sense. So certainly in our Christian context, hope is a very Christian ideal, isn't it?
You would hope so.
Haha. Sue, neighbours talking more. Has that happened through lockdown? Is that something in your community that you've seen? Because that's great. Carrie talking about community growing, and that the church will have grown when we return. That's great. I'd say that's optimism, for sure, definitely.
And I think part of that, just in talking about the use of the word grown, is recognising actually what it might mean for the church to have grown. That people's faith might have matured and grown individually, and so the whole church might have grown in its faith, even if not numerically. But actually that can be a really good stepping point to say, well, actually we've taken massive strides forward, so let's keep going and let's step out as well as step up.
Definitely.
And so actually recognising that growth comes in all kinds of different ways, but all of them can look like hope, I think.
Absolutely.
So the next couple of questions, continuing to think about that sense of hope, how often do you hear talk of hope? And in what ways do you normally hear it talked about?
Yeah, I feel like hope is one of those words that's kind of thrown around a little bit in everyday situations and just everyday sentences. So it's a bit like love. So when people are like, oh, I love cake, I love coffee, I love planking, I love exercise, all these different things. It's a bit like hope, isn't it? I hope the postman will come this morning. I hope my delivery will be delivered on time. I hope it won't rain. It's one of those words, isn't it, that we use, I think, every single day in our vocabulary, really.
Absolutely. It's one of those ones, isn't it, like love, that gets thrown around so casually that it almost loses its sense of what it's really about. Yeah,
brilliant. So, Elizabeth, I use the word hope in just about every email I send at work. Yeah, I mean, it's really easy, isn't it? Just thinking about it. I hope you're okay. I hope you're staying safe. I hope everything's fine with you and your family. It's all the time, isn't it?
Lyndon saying that he often hears hopefully to mean don't take it for granted. Yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at it, isn't it? That it's something's going to happen hopefully rather than saying it's definitely going to happen. That it kind of means that kind of, well, it could happen. We'll be optimistic that it might, but we know that it's not guaranteed, rather than really hoping that something is going to happen.
Susan really offering a contextual one for now, isn't it? At the moment, hope we can meet up soon. Definitely. I think we've used the word hope an awful lot in the last year, haven't we?
Absolutely. And then just as you say, how many times have we written letters or emails or texts or WhatsApp messages or anything else that have started with hope you're all safe and well, which is true, that we genuinely do hope everybody is safe and well. But whether that's a hope in the sense that we're talking about tonight, or whether, as we say, it's one of those ones that doesn't quite mean that, perhaps more meaning Lyndon's use of the word hope in that we can't take it for granted, rather than in a genuine hope for the future type thing. Mum talking about the sense of hope that we hear in prayer for things to be different, for things to change, for people to know God's presence.
Brilliant.
Yeah, that's a good one, thank you.
And I think hope feels very relevant for these kind of Lenten times that we see ourselves in. So it's quite easy, isn't it, to focus on suffering, as we did last week, as we look forward to Holy Week and all that's to come next week. But actually, there is hope as well that comes with the resurrection on Easter Sunday. And I've said this already, haven't I, this year, but that kind of, we spend so long preparing for suffering, for pain, for agony, for the sacrifice of Jesus. We don't spend as long really diving deep into the hope and the celebration of Easter Sunday.
No, definitely. And it's that thing that we think we miss in the Methodist Church, of not quite doing the liturgical seasons properly, if you like, and spending the 4 weeks of Advent, the 6 weeks of Lent, really deep and focused on those things, quite rightly. But then we get to Christmas and we get to Easter and we do it for a day and then move on, rather than doing Christmas for 4 weeks, or Easter for the 6 weeks that the more high church liturgical calendars will have. And so giving it that balance between the challenge but also the hope.
Definitely.
And I think thinking about kind of going back to church and things like that, we've talked about this a few times, haven't we, about what those first services might be like, and trying to get that balance between naming the really painful situations that we've all faced and the challenges and the suffering that we've seen, but also speaking hope and speaking good news at the same time, and saying things have been really, really rubbish, and not pretending that hasn't happened, but also making sure that we say, but God is hope at the same time.
Definitely,
and finding
it's
that
a fine balance, isn't it? Yeah. So, as usual, do you think the Bible has much to say about hope? So when you think about the theme of hope, wherefore art do your eyes cast?
I'm sorry, what? Wherefore art do thou eyes cast?
Yeah, what do you think of in the Bible? What passages do your mind does your mind go to?
I had a really good one in my head.
So thrown you.
It's thrown me a little bit, yeah. The Philippians 4, I want to say. The bit that talks about giving thanks in all situations. We had a talk at council from the president of conference about this reading, and talking about kind of how it says about don't be anxious, don't be afraid. And talking about how often as church these days, actually, this is probably more linking into the second question, but it links Bible and church. So I'll use it as an excuse to cross the two. And talking about how church these days often speaks with a lot of anxiety. About the church's future, about the way society's going, about the difficulties that we face as individual churches and as a national church. And actually saying, look, we're told time and time again in the Bible to not be afraid, to not be anxious. So what does it mean to actually have conversations about the church's future with hope rather than with anxiety, recognising that the crucifixion and resurrection at the very centre of our faith. So recognising that actually even decline and death as a denomination might not be something that's needs to cause fear and anxiety, because we know that God is a God of resurrection.
Yeah, I think Lyndon touches on the key difference between this kind of hope and the world's hope. So the Bible talks about sure and certain hope. It's based on something in which we can trust. So quite different to hoping we can have a holiday this year. Definitely, yeah.
Tony, missed it, there we go. Tony saying that hope always trusts, always perseveres. And I think that links in quite well with the 1 Corinthians reading, faith, hope and love.
Yeah, definitely. But the greatest is love.
It is, but it still says that faith, hope and love are the three that remain.
God.
The three that remain.
Yeah.
Sue saying, I think about Pentecost and the disciples looking and waiting for the Holy Spirit. How joyful and amazing it was when he came.
And if Moira was here, I'm sure she would suggest her favourite Noah. Actually, in the hope with which Noah waited with a couple of bottles of vodka in the in the boat, just waiting for God, for that sign of hope, for the dove and those sorts of things. And Moira would say it if she was here, but she's not.
I'm sure. And we hear lots of stuff in the prophets, don't we, in the Old Testament, about particularly those who were talking during the exile, that God is still in charge, that things will go back, that there will be freedom for God's people once again. And you see it talking to Abraham of, you will become a father of many nations. And it's just throughout, isn't it? All of those prophecies right from the very beginning of God saying, look, there is hope here, things are going to get better. Right through to the very end. Yeah.
And we have Sarah as well being told that she's gonna bear a child, and the way that Sarah laughs at that, and it makes me think about hope and that kind of idea that sometimes our hopes might feel a bit pie in the sky and a little bit laughable. And where's the line between hope and naivety? But yeah, we'll talk about that later, I'm sure.
Definitely. Susan got a good one there. I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to give you a hope and a future, from Jeremiah 29. Yeah, that's a beautiful verse, that one. And that's one of those prophets speaking during the exile, saying that things will get better.
So, do you think the church has much to say about hope?
And do you think it does say much? If it has much to say, does it say much?
Oh, fair.
Slightly separate questions, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you think the church has much to say about hope? What do you think? Do you think the church has as much to say about hope at all?
I don't know, really, because I suppose hope and justice for me go hand in hand, really. You know, if we can hope in a better future, if we can trust that God makes all things good and God's working in the world, I think there needs to be a sense in which justice comes into play and we move. We don't just kind of hope for things, but I think we need to be intentional as a church in striving for them, I suppose. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure we say enough about hope, or certainly not living out hope, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the one thing I struggle with when I hear about hope in church a lot of the times. It feels like, and I'm just as guilty of this as anyone else. A lot of the time when we talk about hope, we kind of brush over it almost and talk about as this kind of distant, ambiguous kind of hope that God is hope, and so we can cling on to God because there is hope there. And we kind of never quite get into the nitty gritty. Well, what does that mean? What does that look like? Which hopefully we'll do as we go through tonight.
Yeah.
But thinking about that sense of what does it mean to have hope, as we thought about a little bit with what it looks like. But maybe we need to be more specific when we talk about hope as church. Ingrid saying a similar thing. Yes, it does have much to say about hope, but it doesn't say it enough. Definitely. So thinking about some of those things then, do we think that hope and faith are topics that overlap easily?
Welcome, Rachel. I'm glad you've apologised. We've been very quiet without you, so thanks for arriving.
You were specifically named as someone who wasn't here. By Nat, I should say.
Rachel, do you find hope and faith to be topics that overlap easily? I'm just joking, you don't have to answer that, but you should. I hope you will.
Goodness me. It's going to be a lot of that this evening.
Oh, Lyndon, we had the big Hope 08 event, a whole wet weekend of hope. I have no idea what that is, Jez, I'm afraid.
So I think the Hope 08 was, Hope Together, the charity.
Yeah.
So I think it was something organised by them that basically in communities all over the country, churches put on events and activities to really kind of reach out and serve the communities around them and to spread something of the good news.
Okay.
And I think that's kind of one of those.
Andrew said yes. Okay, so we've got a Bible passage as usual for us to explore together. We're going to look at the Beatitudes. I wonder if that speaks of hope to you immediately. If not, we will explain.
Hopefully it will by the time we've finished.
But as we're reading, just those usual questions to look out for and be ready with. What stands out to you in this reading? What questions does the reading raise? And what does it remind you of in the Bible and in our lives? So what stands out, what questions, and what does it remind you of? So if you're using your Bibles, we're reading from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak, and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you, falsely, on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you.
Brilliant. So as Nat said, those same three questions that we've had kind of following every reading so far. What stands out to you in that reading? What questions does it raise? And what does it remind you of in the Bible or in life? So what stands out to you? What questions does it raise? And what does it remind you of? So what about yourself?
No, I'm keeping quiet.
We're keeping quiet?
Yeah.
I was just checking.
Let people have chance now. I don't want to give away my best material straight away.
That's fair enough. So what stands out to you in the Beatitudes reading? What questions are there? This awkward pause as we
I
wait for
know.
the delay to
It'll
catch
come.
up.
It'll come.
I hope something stands out to people anyway, otherwise this would be really awkward.
Okay, what stands out to you?
I find being blessed different to blessed. Some of the blessed people are unexpected, if you see what I mean. So yeah, I think saying that the categories that it describes as blessed are people we probably wouldn't normally associate with what we would say we are blessed if we are ... As I guess Pam says there, kind of following it up, when going through difficult times we don't always think that we are blessed. Definitely not. I think that's something that well, we've talked about in different ways before, haven't we, of saying kind of that's part of the reason it's so important to tell stories and think about our life journeys, because actually it's looking back that we often see where the blessings have been in difficulties.
Yeah.
But when we're going through them, it's much, much harder to see.
Yeah, definitely. So Sue saying we wouldn't hope for any of these blessings. I think that's important, isn't it? This isn't a kind of call from Jesus for us all to make ourselves meek and persecuted, but it's just recognising that even in those situations, they're blessed. Even when we go through those seasons of life, we can know God's blessing upon us, rather than intentionally praying for God to make us persecuted and lowly and meek. That's not what's being asked of us here, is it?
No. Similar to what we were talking about last week, isn't it, with that concept of Christians suffering, of it not being about going out and seeking out suffering, because then we're being good Christians, but recognising that actually sometimes journeying for faith will bring us to that place.
Yeah, and I think Linda makes an important point that being blessed doesn't erase the difficult situation. I think it just gives us a sense that God's with us in this. And God sits in the boat with us, really. Just, which I think Alan touches on here. Jesus was speaking to people under occupation. The Beatitudes reminded them that it would not always be as bleak as it might have been for them.
And Sue, building on what she said earlier about not hoping for some of the challenges that people face, but we do hope for the consequences as they're described, which we see, don't we, in verse 12, and we'll come back to a bit later. Ingrid saying that same similar thing of highlighting how we're not on our own when we're going through all of these difficult times. Brilliant. Yeah,
Alan, so Jesus showing them a different perspective of eternity. So for me, when you read the Beatitudes, there's this sense of hoping more, that kind of hoping this is not it. Like, even though you're in this difficult situation, better days are coming. You can hope in the future because God is good, and God's with you in the tough stuff, but God's also going to be with you in what's to come for you. And when it talks about the kingdom of heaven, that's kind of the ultimate hope and the ultimate promise, isn't it? To be with Jesus for eternity.
And I think that's, as you say about that kingdom of heaven, is where we see that balance of some of the good things that happen in the world is the kingdom breaking in. But we know that it hasn't fully come, and so there's still plenty of things that we do genuinely hope for and see.
Does it leave anyone with questions? That's what I wonder. Because this is a great passage. I know it's a favourite for many people. Does it ever leave anyone with any questions? Not that we're saying we're going to answer them, but we can at least sit in the questions together, if so.
So as you think about maybe some of the questions it might raise, as we said at the beginning, a lot of what we've talked about over these last few weeks has probably been really challenging and really difficult. And so kind of we chose this reading because we think it does give quite a different perspective on some of these things, changes the tone and perhaps of the conversation by focusing on God's blessings. And so the next couple of questions we've got kind of invite us to think about that. So when you hear this reading of the Beatitudes, do you find this reading encouraging or challenging? And in what ways have you heard this passage talked about in the past? Because I think often that can colour how we hear different passages. And so what things have you heard said about this when you might have heard it preached on or discussed or shared about in church? And then do you find it encouraging or challenging as you read it? Lyndon raising an interesting question.
Do we choose if and how we receive the blessings?
Sorry, that was in no way a reflection on
No.
Lyndon's question, and more a reflection on about to sneeze. Brilliant, yeah, very interesting question.
Yeah, Elizabeth says encouraging. Brilliant,
That's
brilliant.
good news.
Mm.
What about you when you hear that reading? Does it strike you as one that's encouraging or challenging?
I wonder if it's challenging with respect to those people on the margins of church, those people who might not look and have the life of a typical Christian. I mean, I know Christians come in all shapes and sizes with all different types of personalities and those sorts of things. But I suppose when we go through the list, you've got people in absolute dire struggle and agony and suffering, being blessed. And are they the people that we would easily invite into our churches? I suppose. So recognising even though God's blessing is upon them, that doesn't necessarily mean they're people who would be easily found in the churches in terms of buildings, I think. So not necessarily saying that God isn't with them and those sorts of things, obviously, but recognising God is everywhere, not just where the church buildings are. So I suppose I find it challenging because I wonder how many of these people are on the margins of church rather than within our buildings, finding a place of welcome and potentially a place of healing.
Yeah, that's a really good question, a really good challenge to think about. As somebody said earlier, doesn't it, about that changing of perspective and seeing people and seeing things as God sees them rather than as we do. And actually, as people have said, we probably don't consider these things very blessed. But God here says that they are, which challenges us to think maybe a little bit differently.
Yeah, Lyndon, I think that's right. I think churches might be part of the blessing to them. But I suppose my question is when people are broken and fragile and struggling, although they might know God with them, are our churches places of healing? And we've talked about this throughout lockdown, and preaching online lately, really, just that sense in which do we allow people to bring their whole selves into our church families, so not just the perfect way that they might want to portray themselves as everything's okay, but do we also allow space for healing when actually people are in pain and really struggling with grief and suffering? So yeah, just a challenge for me anyway, to think about it in that way.
And I think that challenge for me really comes through in funerals. So whenever I start funerals, I always start with two readings. I am the resurrection and the life, says the Lord. Those couple of verses, and then say that the verse
Blessed are those who mourn.
4, isn't it? Yeah. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And starting off each funeral service with that, and grounding it in not pretending that for a moment that what we're doing isn't difficult and painful, but actually recognising that comfort that comes through those difficult times.
Yeah, and I think Rachel speaks into this a bit. So she says, I think it's a hard concept to explain to anyone not familiar with Christianity that we're blessed in the hard times, a bit like trying to explain suffering. I think that's so true, because it's a lovely sentiment that we're saying all the time, isn't it? That God's with us in all circumstance, in all situations, in the mess as well as the good. But how do you kind of explain that side of your faith, that aspect of being blessed in those difficult times to the outside world, who might actually turn around and say, well, if God's all powerful and all wonderful, why can't God just take that suffering away from you?
Which brings us really well to think. I think what Lyndon says and some of the challenges that we've heard around COVID as well, haven't we? And people saying that God has sent the pandemic to teach people lessons about what X, Y, or Z. And so hearing that, actually, when we talk about blessings coming from suffering, well, does that mean God sent us suffering so that he can bless us? Which we've said before, but we'll say again, just to be absolutely clear, no. I don't believe that for a moment. I think I keep coming back to that verse that Paul, I know you don't like him, but that verse that Paul writes, God works all things for the good of those who love him. Not saying that God sends all things and therefore they are all good, even when actually they're really bad, but recognising that actually God can use even the worst of situations for good in some way. It doesn't mean the situation becomes good, but it means that good can come of it. And I think that's the same here with, it doesn't mean that this suffering is blessed, but you can be blessed while you are suffering.
Yeah. So I think Pam just touching on some of these things we've talked about churches and not always finding that you can bring some situations into church in the past, which Tony helpfully says, as churches, I think we're getting better at accepting people and their pain.
It's almost like they might have had similar experiences being died. Yeah,
maybe.
Who knew? But I think that's absolutely right, and one of the big challenges for us as church to be places where we can bring any situations, any challenges or difficulties. So as we read through the Beatitudes reading, I think you can probably see how the Beatitudes split quite nicely into two groups of four. The first being about different groups of people who suffer but are blessed, and the second group of four being about the way you can be blessed in kind of responding to some of the more difficult things in the world. So thinking about those kind of the fact that it's split up into these two different.
So
categories.
what are the two categories again? Just make it really
clear. So the
clear.
first one is the verses 3 to 6. So the blessed are people who are struggling.
Yeah.
And then the second group of 4 is verses 7 to 10. Blessed are those who act in a certain way. So are merciful, are pure, are peacemakers, and so on.
Okay.
So thinking about that, the fact that it's split into these two groups and one comes before the other, why do you think the reading is laid out in this way? And what do you think it tells us maybe about God's priorities? Proper hardcore Bible study type question.
It feels that, yeah.
Rachel saying there, have you read this in the Message translation? A very interesting version. I have before. I remember thinking it's a really nice version, but not tonight. Unfortunately, I haven't got it with me. But there are some really, really interesting translations that Eugene Peterson's done in the Message. The Message is always a good translation to have to hand, to have to talk about, because it does look at some things so differently. Sometimes very American, as you might expect with an American author, but sometimes actually words things in really good and new ways, I think. But yeah, so just thinking about kind of the way it's laid out, what do you think about the fact that these Beatitudes are split into two groups of 4 and look at different things, and what does it tell us about God's priorities? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just giving people a chance to say something. But I suppose there's that kind of learning experience when you go through something, you come out of it and try to make it for good. So God working in you through your experiences to minister to other people. But I suppose a sense in which we're not just called to recognise our suffering, but to then alleviate the suffering of others and to go and act as a result of something we've been through, to go forward and try to alleviate someone else's struggles.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I like that, Lyndon. That's great. So Lyndon, I've heard the Beatitudes described as a process, starting with being broken before we're ready to respond. I like that. Any other thoughts? Possibly?
So any other thoughts about why... what does it tell us particularly maybe about God's priorities, I wonder?
So Carrie says the first part seems to say the comfort is there, and the second part shows strength to those who help. Yeah, I think it's healthy, isn't it, that it not just recognises those people who go through life sufferings, but also those people who work within the suffering times.
For me, I always find it really interesting. I think it links really well with the concept of the first will be last and the last will be first. And saying actually what matters to God almost most is those people who are facing these difficult and painful situations. Actually the first people that God comes to bless are those who really struggle. And then obviously God still has plenty of blessings left over for everybody else, for people that work with others and support others and care for others. But actually the first priority for God is those, as you've said, on the margins, those in difficulty and pain.
An important question, I think, from Alan. It's about how we interpret what's happening to us. Do we see hardship as an opportunity? And I think that's a really important question, actually. Do we see those times of struggle and difficulty as then an opportunity to go on and minister to others in the same thing? Do we kind of take a learning moment from it, really? And maybe that depends on us all as individuals, I suppose. So, like, one of the things when you go through candidating before going to Vicar College are these questions about experience. And it really gets on my nerves, because what they want you to say is, oh yeah, I'm a trained lawyer, a trained doctor, a trained teacher, whatever. And I've done that for 30 years and now I feel the call to ministry. And that is the answer that they often look for and want. So I was told, at 21, you need to really think about your experience and what you can bring to that question. And I just thought about all of my life experience so far in terms of, my childhood and how I grew up and some of the difficulties and the struggles around that. And actually how I could use those experiences of difficulty, of brokenness and struggle to minister to other people. So I suppose I wasn't intentionally looking for learning moments, but recognising how my experiences could enable me to come alongside others who were facing similar things.
Yeah, and there's a brilliant image, isn't there, that we got taught at college from Henry Newen, that talks about the concept of the wounded healer, and how kind of we minister to people from our wounds, essentially. And those things that have really hurt us or challenged us, we can then use them, as you say, to be able to go and speak to and minister to others. And that doesn't mean that we pour out all our hurt on other people that are hurting. But it means that actually once we've come through them, we have that opportunity to say, actually, this is how I experience God. This is what I saw as hope.
It's being able to go deeper, isn't it, in that relationship and in that ministry to people. Because if you've gone through similar situations, you can really empathise with that.
Absolutely.
Not to say you can't to an extent anyway if you haven't, but at the same time it's just...
It is different though,
It's different, yeah.
Andrew making a really good point that this... Jesus talking about these people being blessed would have really challenged the view at the time. If you're going through hard times, then it was God not blessing you. Often, I think we see it elsewhere in Scripture, don't we? That it's punishment for sins.
Yeah.
Which is Jesus here unequivocally saying, no, it's not how it works. He did it in exactly that voice as well. So
did he?
Yeah,
did
exactly that voice.
Yeah. Brilliant. Interesting. So the final two verses of this passage act as a warning about the challenge of living as Christ lived. Do you just want to read the last two?
Yeah, I've got the last one on the next slide because we're talking specifically about that one.
Yeah.
But the last two: blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you.
So I suppose this ties into that question of learning experiences out of and seeing things as opportunities. So how can we encourage others to keep on the difficult journey for the sake of others? I'm not sure how much I'm keen on this question, only because I think we need to encourage people to keep on a difficult journey for the sake of themselves as much as the sake of others.
So I was meaning this in the sense of standing up for justice.
Right.
Can be a really difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
How do we encourage others that are standing up for justice to keep going when things are really hard?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I thought we were talking about keep suffering for the sake of other people then.
No.
That's a bit harsh.
So this in the
as
we're thinking obviously about the bowl and the towel and serving and living it out and thinking about all the things that we've talked about over the previous 4 weeks and how we can take them forward. For me, this was linking in with the kind of Maundy Thursday narrative of Jesus kind of almost encouraging his followers to say, actually, look, this is what following me looks like. That it's standing up for others, it's living for others, and it will bring you to really difficult places, but it's worth it because you will encounter God through this. And so it's thinking of it in that sense. That how do we encourage people to keep
That
standing
makes
up
better
for justice.
sense. That definitely makes better sense.
I was trying
Rather
to word
than
it.
keep suffering for other people, you selfish person. Yeah, that's
I was trying to
definitely-
word it in such a way that
Yeah,
linked it
yeah.
to the Bible verse as well as to what I was
Yeah.
trying to say. But yeah. So how can we encourage others to keep on for justice, even when it's difficult, for the sake of others? Does that make more sense?
Yeah. How can we encourage others to keep on
For justice.
striving for justice? Yeah.
Keep on keeping on.
Yeah, pretty much. What do you think?
Well, I think it's talking about, and we'll come on to this a little bit later, talking about what hope and what good news looks like, and saying that actually things aren't hopeless, that justice does come. I came across a great phrase that I saw someone talking about online the other day, that the arc of existence bends towards justice. And saying that actually it might be a really long and difficult road, but justice does eventually come in most situations. That it might not even be in our lifetimes, but things do move in a very slow and steady way towards justice. That there will be blips and backwards tracks and all sorts on the road, but things do get there. And I think actually keeping that as a focal point, that it is for a reason, that it does have a purpose, that it isn't just banging your head against a brick wall constantly, can be a real encouragement.
Yeah.
I think.
And I think maybe we saw something of encouraging others to keep on striving for justice for the sake of others with the Black Lives Matters protests during lockdown, actually. And that's that kind of sense in which people were standing up and encouraging others to stand with them and fight for racial justice, not for themselves, but for future generations. So the future generations didn't have to be in the same position of fighting for equality, fighting for a voice, fighting for fairness and justice. So kind of fighting the fight now, so those who come after don't have to.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. The computer's caught up with itself. We thought you were all being really, really quiet. Up.
Up.
Keep going up, yeah. There's loads here now. Okay, down. Yeah, so Rachel's quoting Micah.
That's one of your favourite verses.
It is. And encouraging with prayer. I think that's really important as Christians to pray for those who are standing up for justice, definitely.
Ingrid saying again about the importance of sharing our own experiences with them, sharing the word of God and what he stands for and the blessings that God has in store for them. Yeah, definitely. So as we kind of move on to then this concept of living it out, we wanted to think about that balance of serving others but also having hope and what it means to kind of live out both of those things together. So thinking about that, is it easy to see hope in work that helps the most vulnerable? So when we're serving in food banks or working with the homeless or helping those suffering from addictions, is it easy to see hope in that work?
Yeah.
And if it is or if it isn't, how can we ensure that all that we do does offer hope for the future as well as help for now?
Yeah, this is a difficult one, isn't it? Because I suppose I see hope in the church when, as a minister, churches want to start a food bank, for example, and or be part of a homeless shelter, program and those sorts of things. And that makes me see hope for a church that's striving for justice. But it doesn't necessarily help me see hope in the world and the community that we're serving. And this is the difficulty. So like at our food bank, we always feel really hopeful when someone who's been coming week in, week out to the food bank doesn't come. We suddenly have this twinge of hope of maybe they didn't need to this week. And but then obviously it's very quickly overridden by, well, we hope they're okay, actually. But one of our questions is hopefully that means that they're in a better position now, and so don't need a food parcel this week, and that's good news.
Definitely.
But it's difficult to find hope in work that's serving communities and the vulnerable people within them, because quite often it's just, horrific that people are in these positions where they can't feed themselves and their children, where they're wrestling with addictions and battling that every single day, and obviously losing the roof over their heads. And I think that's what we're really seeing a surge of right now after lockdown, actually.
And I think the way in which we talk about these different kinds of activities really demonstrates this. In how often have we heard kind of people talk about the work that a food bank does, or the work that some kind of group does, and oh, it was really good, we had X amount of people come along. And then almost as you've said it,
you realise,
check in yourself and say, well,
that's
no, it's not good that
no.
that many people came, but it's good that they found us.
Yeah.
And just kind of recognising the difficulty that comes with this. And I know it's one of the things that I really wrestled with Heaton Park being the night shelter for the Boaz Trust, of the group of asylum seekers that come and spend Tuesday nights at Heaton Park. It's kind of saying, well, how can we talk about hope to people who literally have nothing, who are sleeping on the streets, and the only shelter they've got is overnight in a church building? And how do you talk of hope in that situation? And that's what I was just going to say, what Pam's come up with.
Yeah.
That actually hope can be found in the stories that people share with you. And that actually a lot of the time it isn't about those who might be leading these groups or volunteering at them to say, well, this is what hope is. But instead the people who are in those positions saying, well, actually, yes, things are incredibly difficult, but hope looks like the fact that I'm even still alive.
Yeah.
A lot of the time.
There's a humility and a humbleness, isn't there, about hope, I think, in some of these situations, for sure.
Ingrid making that point about it not always being easy to see hope as we're overwhelmed by all the suffering that's around us. Yeah, and I think that's where these questions were kind of leading us as we wrote them, weren't they? I saying that actually these are probably some of the most difficult questions that we've asked across the whole 5 weeks. Because actually hope can feel so overwhelmed by injustice, which is why we wanted to finish with hopefully a slightly more positive session.
Lyndon says Jesus started with people's physical needs but never left it at that. And maybe that's what sets apart some of the community work and social outreach work that churches do, or should set it apart. Because, we can offer people a food parcel, but we can also offer them hope in form of a prayer. Hope in the form of good news, hope in telling them, things are really hard, but Jesus is with you. But then I'll be honest with you, it's not often in those situations that any of us have the guts to say it, because, when you can't feed your children and you're bringing them out in their pyjamas, broken shoes in the rain to come and receive a small food parcel to keep you going a few days, how can you say to those people, it's all right, Jesus is with you? And I think this ties in a little bit to some of the comments earlier, actually, about the difficulty sometimes of sharing that hope that we see as Christians with the world around us.
And this is something where I think the church generally struggles, because not by any means unanimously, but I think a lot of people that come to church tend to be more middle class, more better off. And as I say, not everybody by any stretch of the imagination.
A good number,
but a good number, and particularly those who might actually feel able to offer time and aren't struggling in all kinds of different ways, are those who do have that kind of life experience, certainly where I come from. And so actually dealing with those situations and being able to offer hope to something is very, very difficult, because I've simply never faced what they've faced. And so actually in one of the things that the Methodist Church is talking about at the moment in the evangelism and growth strategy is about church in the margins, being led by people from the margins, not by us as institutional church going to where they are and saying, look, we're here to save you. But actually saying, well, who do we already know that are in those margins, and how can we equip them to lead these groups who have those experiences, who have those relationships, who can talk of hope. And that's a really powerful way of being church, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's so difficult. I do, because, just from my own experiences, I suppose, before I came to the church. But, someone saying to you, well, you can, hope and trust that Jesus is with you in this. Or you can hope and trust that God's with you and things are going to get better. That's not going to feed your children. That's not going to stop your son from being a drug addict. It's difficult. I find it, it's really hard, because for Christians, I think there's so much power in the hope of Jesus, in our trust, in our faith, and it's powerful for us. but how easily does that then translate to the outside world in the sufferings that they're going through?
Absolutely.
And as I say, maybe it's something to do with the demographic. Maybe. I'm not sure. Yeah.
I think it's probably many different things, and everybody would struggle to share hope in all kinds of different circumstances for all kinds of different reasons.
I find the third question fairly challenging as well. What does hope look like in situations of injustice? And just bringing it back to something I mentioned earlier, and that need to act and to strive for justice as well as just hope in it. You know, when I think about things like Black Lives Matter, like Marcus Rashford, for example, that Elizabeth's talked about here, and childhood poverty, it's really good to sit in our churches and say, well, I hope one day all people of all colours will feel equal, will feel they have the same opportunities and the same, you know, all of that. There will be justice, and it's good to sit in our churches and say, I hope one day no child will go to school hungry. And that's great, but I think there comes a point where we actually need to act. It's not enough to just sit in our churches and hope for those things. We actually do also need to be a voice in that striving for justice.
Absolutely.
So I think the third question I think is a real challenge. What does hope look like in situations of injustice? I'm not sure it looks like just sitting on the margins and saying, or I really wish they wouldn't kick up such a fuss, or I really wish they wouldn't share their experiences, that makes me uncomfortable, or I really wish they'd find a better way to protest that didn't cause me such uncomfortable disruption. I don't think it's enough to just sit back and judge those things. I think you need to be in the thick of it, actually.
Definitely. And that, I think, a lot of the time is where we see Jesus on the front line with people crying out for justice and saying, actually, this is not okay. And that doesn't mean that we're sitting here excusing violence or anything like that before any comments are pop up along those lines.
Yeah.
But it means actually recognising that sometimes that kind of difficulty comes because this has been decades, centuries of these difficulties and injustices and oppression. And
just hoping things will get better doesn't always work. Sometimes there is a need for further action than just sitting and hoping that, you know, racial injustice is going to get better for my grandchildren because it's terrible for me and I just have to hope that it'll be better. And
I know it's one of these theological ideas that I've talked about many times, and that's because it really chimes with me, from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, talking about the ultimate and the penultimate way of getting to things, and how the ultimate is obviously God's perfect way of perfect peace and perfect justice and everything being exactly as God says that it should be. But actually recognising that a lot of the times in this world we get there via penultimate means, which aren't the ultimate, which aren't perfect. And this coming from someone who was obviously suffering under the Nazi regime in Germany, and who was part of the plot to kill Hitler, recognising that killing is wrong, but actually sometimes saying that theologically we have to do things that don't quite sit right with our faith, because it is the only way to make a change.
Not that we're advocating for that.
No, but just saying that actually sometimes it comes to do really difficult things that don't seem right because of what they're moving towards. Yeah,
your mum says hope in injustice can only be when justice happens for all. I like that. That could be the quote of the night. Should we cheer ourselves up with some good news?
Indeed. So what we wanted to finish, and not quite finish with, but what we wanted to have tonight is recognising that we've talked a lot about all the injustices and all the difficulties and all the suffering that happens in the world. But to offer some good news that means that maybe these things aren't going to be like this forever. And so we've got, I think, 9 different bullet points of good stuff that's happened in the world in relation to issues of justice and poverty.
And if you're on Instagram, don't just follow our sausage dogs, but if you're on Instagram, there is actually a page called Good News Stories, and it'll give you like a news update every week of all the good things that have happened this week. It's really joyful, so you might want to go and share that and follow that if you're on Instagram, and follow our sausage dogs, @sausagebros.
Goodness me.
Good news.
Thinking about good news, so we've got some here that are related to kind of poverty and challenges around the world. And the fact that infant mortality rates, which is children under the age of 5, dying all around the world have decreased by 60% worldwide in the last 30 years. And again, it shows there's still more to do, but actually what an amazing thing to have happened, that 60% lower mortality rates in the last 30 years.
In the last 30 years as well, more than 1 billion people have been lifted out of extreme poverty. I think that's a great one to just remind ourselves of in light of conversations about food banks tonight, actually.
And again, it doesn't mean there isn't much more work to do, but 1 billion people being lifted out of the most extreme forms of poverty has got to be good news.
Yeah.
And kind of going along with that, literacy rates around the world have increased by 4% every 5 years for the last 60 years. And the statistic that this came with said 100 years ago, literacy rates for the whole world were about 12%. Only 12% of people could read or write. It's now only about 12% of people who can't read or write.
Brilliant.
Which is a complete reversal, which is wonderful.
Polio has been almost completely eradicated, with 42 cases in just 3 countries.
And I was talking to someone the other day on the phone from church who was saying about when polio was a real issue in this country and around the world, that actually they told me a story of how one of their closest friends had died of polio, and just how kind of traumatic and difficult it was. And so seeing that it's got down to just 42 cases in 3 countries around the world.
Amazing, yeah.
It's brilliant. And a similar thing with malaria and TB, that case rates are now at their lowest in decades. And I think I did put a statistic in. Yeah, so that in for malaria, that's 7.6 million people deaths that have been avoided, and 60 million TB deaths that have been avoided through people not contracting the disease.
HIV and AIDS diagnoses have dropped to their lowest level in 20 years.
And obviously there have been great improvements in treatment as well along the other side of that. And looking at a slightly less human good news around the world, looking at some kind of environmental good news stories. A good number of endangered species have been taken off the most at-risk list in the last year, including the Iberian Lynx.
What is that?
The most endangered cat species in the world.
Oh, you're happy then.
Which is why I noticed that.
Brilliant. The African elephant population has doubled in the last year. Amazing.
The number of mountain gorillas that have been born in Uganda in the wild has doubled in the last year as well. And the caption said, unprecedented numbers. I think it was like 7.
I love it.
But so doesn't sound particularly high, but it's on the up, and that's got to be a good thing.
Deaths caused by terrorism worldwide have dropped by 59% in the last 5 years. The biggest drops here have been Nigeria and Afghanistan.
2 countries that really struggle with all kinds of different terrorist incidents, as we know. And then the last one, I put in there because we talked about it in a previous session, about the fact that global carbon emissions have dropped by 7% in the last year.
It's a good reminder.
It's a good reminder that's brilliant. But obviously that was during a lockdown year, so recognising that needs to continue.
Keep going.
Once lockdowns are over as well. So hopefully those things have given you a little bit of a smile, a little bit of hope, a little bit of good news that change can happen in the world, even when a lot of the time maybe it doesn't feel like it because we don't hear these things.
So, how can each of us make sure these conversations become actions throughout the rest of the year? So not just these conversations tonight, but the conversations all the way through Lent. How can we make sure this goes beyond Lent? Because really these conversations about justice should be everyday conversations, not just for Lent. So any suggestions? How can each of us make sure these conversations become actions throughout the rest of the year? And then I know a couple of people, particularly after the climate one, a couple of people went and bought shampoo bars actually. But what's one action off the back of the last few conversations about justice? What's one action that you can commit to for the next 12 months? Go on, what are you committing to, Jez? Hack?
It's kind of a step back, I guess, from a specific action as such, but then actually committing to reading more variety of news stories. So when I hear a headline or see something, not just reading one article from the newspaper or news site that I prefer, but actually trying to dig a bit deeper and say, well, what else is happening here? What are we not being told? Whose voices aren't we hearing? So, for example, with the vigil that was held for Sarah Everard, not just taking it as the news report of police have dispersed a crowd that were breaking COVID regulations, but going behind it and listening to some of the stories of the women that were there, of the way they were being manhandled and dragged around and mistreated, and the way in which people who were just seeking to have a peaceful time of remembrance for a tragic event were then kind of demonstrated the point perfectly, sadly, of actually how difficult that can be sometimes. So looking for those voices that we don't always hear in the headlines.
As long as you don't start reading The Sun, that is absolutely fine.
I have absolutely no intention of ever touching a copy of The Sun, never mind reading it.
Brilliant.
Or the Daily Mail. Don't read the Daily Mail.
Is anyone else,
either.
one action that you're committing to for the next 12 months? I don't know if we've got a lag or if everyone's just being quiet.
What would yours be?
But these are two really important questions.
What are you going to commit to for the next 12 months?
Ooh. Well, I'm going to commit to turning the lights off, which I think I've been doing better at.
A little bit.
A little bit.
But you've got 12 months to work on it, so it's fine.
That was a big one for me. I think sharing stories that might make people uncomfortable, in terms of just kind of using and giving a platform to those people whose stories are often silenced and not talked about. So I know this was something people focused on during, again, the Black Lives Matter protest. Everybody just put a black square on their social media, and we're not talking today. We're allowing black people to share their experiences on social media, and this is their space. So yeah, I suppose more of the same of that, but in a variety of areas.
Yeah, brilliant.
It's not like making New Year's resolutions. This is a commitment between you and God.
Oh,
Publicly on social media.
indeed.
I've kept the heating down. Brilliant. Good news.
Excellent. Using less gas, using less pollution.
Good.
Excellent.
We have got some homework for you.
Because what is church without homework?
Yeah, this is focused on tonight's session specifically, but please keep in mind those two questions about how can we keep these discussions going, how can we act on these conversations, and something you want to commit to. But, you know, as I say, it's between you and God. If you go away from here and keep all the lights on, then, you know.
Alan's got a good one.
Brilliant.
I cut down on red meat and I use soya milk because of the carbon footprint of cattle farming.
I gotta be honest, I'm not a fan of soya milk. I drink oat milk.
It's the same principle though, isn't
Yeah,
it?
no, it's true. But, Alan, if you want like a creamier milk, oat milk's the way forward.
As long as you shake the thing and don't
Yeah.
pour the water out. And saying listening more to other people's points of view.
Brilliant. Absolutely.
And I think that one's so important, particularly when actually they're views that people don't want to hear. And something that I've been really challenged with over the last few months is a lot of the time whenever we were talking about some kind of justice issue and someone would say something that kind of I disagreed with or that was kind of trying to argue for the status quo and say that actually things aren't that bad, I'd kind of palm it off with, oh, well, that's your opinion, I suppose, that's fine.
Yeah.
But actually having the courage to say, no.
The status quo isn't sexism,
that's simply not true.
homophobia.
And there's a meme going around on Facebook that you've probably seen of a number painted on the ground, and one person on one side pointing at it and saying that's a number 9, and somebody on the other side pointing at it and saying that's a number 6, and then the whole thing that goes with it is, isn't everybody right? They're just looking at it from different perspectives, and saying that actually no, objectively somebody wrote that number and it is one thing. And so recognising actually what the correct one of those might be, and saying that actually sometimes, no, racism is a thing, and you might not see it in the way that other people do because you haven't experienced it, but it is real. And not saying that everyone is entitled to their opinion or their truth just because it's only their experience, but saying that actually, no, there is an objective truth sometimes, and being brave enough to call it out and say, you can say that, but it's not right.
You can't claim it's truth. Yeah. Pam makes a good point to anybody on social media. It can be good to audit your social media if you have it and follow those who are using their account to educate and challenge injustice. And if you're on Instagram, that's a great place to find people who are engaged in all sorts of these conversations about justice.
Definitely. But back to the exciting stuff.
Homework.
Back to the homework.
Yes. So first of all, we want to encourage you to tell the good news stories as well as raise justice issues. So I know we've talked about justice an awful lot, and quite often that's all a bit negative and talking about what we can challenge, what we can do better. But there are good news stories, as we shared this evening.
Mm-hmm.
So sharing them as well. Because I don't know about you, everyone's a bit fed up of watching the news at the moment, I think. Because it's always negative. So share the good news as well as the bad.
So following on from that, now that we're all fed up with the news, also then challenge to pay attention to the news. And as we do it, don't just do it and listen to it and think, oh, isn't that terrible? But bring things to God in prayer. But as we do that, always listen and always recognise that God could be calling us to be the answer to prayer. Not just praying for God to miraculously intervene and make the world a better place, but to say, actually, God, how can you use me to make the world a better place?
And then just remember that a change is never too small to make a difference. So never think a change is too small to make a difference. And never be afraid to stand up for justice or to speak out for others.
As I attempted to say tonight in one of my questions but failed, it's not an easy thing to do always, to stand up for justice or speak out for others. But it's something that we're all called to do and called to work on.
Should we pray together?
I think we should. So we've got a prayer that's going to pop up on the screen.
Should we make it big?
Ta-da!
Okay.
And as we do, we're simply going to say it and read it through together and pray together. So let's pray. God of grace, help us to hope nonetheless, hope despite, hope regardless, hope still, hope where we had ceased to hope, hope amid what threatens hope, hope with those who feed our hope, hope beyond what we had hoped, hope that draws us past our limits, hope that defies expectations, hope that questions what we have known, hope that makes a way where there is none, hope that takes us past our fear, hope that calls us into life, hope that holds us beyond death, hope that blesses those to come. May we always remember your hope and share it with the world so in need. Amen.